But Richard the Lionheart would never see his masterpiece in all its glory.
Richard, of course, was addicted to fighting, and he'd gone down to Limousin to deal with some recalcitrant nobles of his, and he'd come up to the chateau of Chalus-Chabrol, which was just a little tower, a pathetic little castle, really, by his standards.
And a crossbow bolt hit him in the shoulder, and then gangrene set in, and from that he died.
But great news for the French, and the French chronicler says, God has visited us in our kingdom today because Richard is dead, and there was general rejoicing.
Richard the Lionheart's death was a disaster for Chateau-Gaillard. For Philippe Auguste, it was a major obstacle out of his way. On the 27th of May, 1199, King John, known as John Lackland, was crowned King of England. As the younger of the brothers, John was not expected to take the throne. Unlike his brothers, he inherited no lands at birth, hence his name, John Lackland.
John was a really despicable figure. He made himself very unpopular, very carelessly.
John didn't have the mind or the tenacity of a medieval general.
He behaved very, very badly without any sense of the chivalry and the principle that his brother displayed.
The new King of England took possession of the fortress at Les Andelys. Contrary to his late brother, for whom Chateau-Gaillard was a military installation, John Lackland saw it as the potential royal residence. A fervent and practicing man of faith, he had constructed within the inner ward an imposing chapel.
It was quite normal in a castle of this dimension to have a chapel. It's just that it looks like an external element brought into the castle to act as a chapel.
It might appear to be just an embellishment, but this place of worship was to play a determining role in the fortress's fate. On the French side, Philippe Auguste took advantage of the change of king to press ahead with his conquest of Normandy. He assembled his best knights and thousands of soldiers, and he set off to attack Chateau-Gaillard. He took up the challenge, and it was quite a challenge. He started by taking the forts at Muret-de-Cléry, Mortemer, Longchamp, and Lyon-la-Forêt, all of which could back up Chateau-Gaillard in resisting his forces.
He cleared some space around the castle to leave it a kind of no-man's land before attacking the symbol of the castle itself.
The French troops advanced towards Chateau-Gaillard was rapid. They broke through the line of defense between Bernières-sur-Seine and Tony and attempted a first attack by the island. In response, the English burnt the bridge. This left the French no choice but to attack from the river.
They can't get too far down because of the blockade across, so they're approaching from land. But there are some very, very dramatic and heroic events that take place in the river.
It's like a blockbuster movie. They had combat swimmers with axes sent out to destroy the boom. Then they sent burning coals or some inflammable liquid in a sealed cauldron that they swam out to the fortifications and palisades around the castle on the island and set fire to them. And that started a general panic.
The English, caught between the flames and the water, fled the island. The panicked inhabitants of the village sought refuge in the castle.
So the people of Les Andelys came to hide in the castle, which was strange, because the castle wasn't built to shelter the villagers. If this was supposed to be a defense, built to block the enemy, a purely military installation, then the villagers had no place there.
The more people there were inside, the quicker the food and supplies would run out.
In the space of a few days, Philippe Auguste and his men had brought down the first defenses Richard the Lionheart had set up. The French were now in possession of the Seine, the island, and the village.
Then the invading forces will then put their own people in the towns, basically colonizing them. So the Normans are kicked out and the French take over their homes. It's one of the spoils of war.
Within months, and with very little difficulty, the French troops had taken the whole area of Les Andelys. Now in the fortress there were 1,500 villagers and 500 soldiers, left polishing their arms and with no intention of surrendering. All around the fortress, Philippe Auguste and his army set up encampments. Their lines of attack and defense were like a whole small town. In addition to the 3,000 French troops, carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, and various administrative staff all settled in around the castle, all of them under the command of the king's army. Knights, squires, pages, infantry, and of course military strategists all shared a common objective: to wear down the defenders of Chateau-Gaillard. The siege could now begin. Would Richard the Lionheart's fortress prove as impregnable as they all said?
There were only a few ways of taking a castle. You could take them by storm, and when a castle was as well designed and well built and as strong as Chateau-Gaillard, that was an option you wanted to reserve for when you absolutely had to. But much the easiest way of taking a castle is by starving it, or by somehow demoralizing the garrison.
To weaken the garrison and the population hiding away inside, the French king decided to set up a proper blockade. He encircled the castle to stop anyone getting either in or out.
The idea is that it's impossible for any food to get in, for anyone to get out with messages, and so forth, so the people inside will be completely isolated.
When you get sieges on this scale, they are very unusual, and they're quite different from the kinds of sieges that you normally read about.
All around the fortress, Philippe Auguste set up 2 lines of defense made up of palisades, ditches, and wooden towers called bretèches. One of these lines was a kind of barricade, a contravallation, that faced the castle, thus preventing anyone from getting out. On the other side, another barricade, or circumvallation, blocked any reinforcements coming over the plateau. These 2 unbreachable lines cut off all communication with the outside. As soon as they were installed, soldiers and craftsmen started building between them siege engines, such as the famous belfries, movable wooden towers.
They had the idea of building towers on the walkway, to be higher than the defenders on the walls, so they could fire down at them.
A belfry was a veritable rolling fortress. At the top was a shooting platform with 10 archers. The lower stories were to fight off any foot soldiers who dared to attack it. Animal skins stretched over its sides protected the structure from flaming arrows. For both those under siege and those besieging them, the archers were an essential element of an army. They could shoot up to 10 arrows a minute. But to attack a fortress, you needed more than just arrows. High up on the plateau, another weapon was already in place, the mangonel.
There's a whole category of machines built on the idea of a pole of 2 unequal lengths, with at one end a sling that launches the shot, and at the other, shorter end, the launching mechanism.
This siege aimed to exhaust the castle's garrison not only physically but psychologically as well. The majority of the attacking forces had to remain immobile behind their lines, but small groups of soldiers were regularly sent out to harass the enemy. Up on their fortifications, though, the English had a weapon that could drive them back, the bricole. Towed by the strongest men, it could fire off very heavy stones over 50 yards. a weapon of redoubtable efficiency against those brave enough to get within its range. From within the fortress, the man calling the shots was its governor, Roger de Lacy.
It was him that John Lackland put in command of navigation on the Seine, and then in 1203 of the castle itself. And he did a good job. He was a steadfast captain and very popular, and admired on both the French and English sides for his great bravery.
Chateau-Gaillard may have stood up well to the initial attacks, but Roger de Lacy knew full well that the coming siege would be a long and difficult one. Throughout the whole siege, the archers were at work both night and day. Rather than aiming at enemy troops in tight formation, they targeted areas of the enemy camp in order to set fires. But despite his efficient defense, by the end of a few weeks under siege, the governor was starting to get worried.
In theory, they should have withstood the siege for at least a year. They had plenty of supplies. But the first mistake that Roger made, and I'm sure he would have come to regret it very quickly, was to let in these civilians from Les Andelys. And we're talking about over 2,000 people, so men, women, children, the elderly, all of whom were absolutely useless in the defense of the castle. And there they were, hungry mouths, rapidly devouring all the supplies that he'd so carefully laid in.
Things were getting urgent, so Roger de Lacy started to ration the food. He also sent to his king, John Lackland, for help.
We know that John sent a message to the commander, Roger de Lacy, at one point, and this message survives. It just says, "Thank you for all you've done, and please hold on as long as possible."
Roger de Lacy knew now that no army would come to his aid. He had to act alone. So he took a terrible decision: to expel some of the villagers, to, in effect, sacrifice them. It was the only way he could withstand the siege any longer.
So a first group was sent out, and Philippe Auguste's men let them pass. Then a second group, and they let them through as well.
Meanwhile, word of this had been sent to Philip, who'd gone off back to France to oversee some other matter, and he was furious. He said, "It's ridiculous. You want to keep them in there because they are shortening the siege by eating up all the supplies, and you are not to let anyone out, whoever they are, men, women, elderly, I don't care."
A few weeks later, a new wave of women, children, and the elderly was turned out of the castle. But this time, they were unceremoniously attacked by the French.
French shoot arrows and javelins and the like at them and force them back to the castle. But at the castle, they've closed the gates to the people, and they have to spend 3 months over winter on the rocky scarp slope of the castle, exposed to the elements, the cold, and without food.
Caught between the two camps, the unfortunate villagers soon died of hunger and cold. Acts of cannibalism even took place. This episode in the siege of Chateau-Gaillard is one of the most tragic of the whole Middle Ages. There were just too many mouths to feed.
Guillaume le Breton wrote that the poor people were so starving that when a woman gave birth, the men immediately ate the baby. That when a chicken got out of the castle, they ate it all, feathers, guts, and all.
Well, they've been abandoned. They thought they were going to be protected by the Castellan, Roger de Lacy, and by their king, and they're not. Instead, they're cast out. But this wasn't uncommon in warfare, because the juggernaut of war overrides all other priorities.
Down there in the ditches, the starving took weeks to die. When winter was over, Philippe Auguste went back out on the battlefield. He alone would assess the situation.
He rode over the ditch and saw what was going on, and they saw him, and they were pleading and begging with him for pity and mercy. And of course he responded, and he took them in and fed them. Apparently many of them died on their first meal. It was rather like the starving from the concentration camps. They were so hungry, they poured food into them, and it killed them. And So very few people survived from all that.
The siege of Chateau-Gaillard was one of the longest of the Middle Ages. It lasted 7 months. By March 1204, the English were fiercely protecting their fortress. Philippe Auguste's patience had run out. He attacked. The castle's unique defenses were going to have to prove their worth.